Hello and welcome to this lecture on the book by Joss Hans, At is for Activism. Now, this book is a rather complex theoretical approach to activism and digital media. So my advice to you is that you perhaps see this lecture first before you read the book, so you are introduced to some of the themes and it perhaps is easier to follow it. So this lecture is gonna follow the book quite closely, and I will also make references to book to pages in the book, so it will be easier for you to go back and forth to the book and the lecture when you read the book. So so I'm gonna start with pay a lot of attention to the starting points in hand, since I think this is the most important to get the starting points at these points of departure in order to understand the rest of the book. Talk a little bit about his theorizing of technology, what digital media or digital technology means for activism, come into the mobilization and smart mobs argument that he makes, and then end with his discussion on constructing the commons, an argument that has become recently common to make lately. So starting from the beginning here, the starting point. Now, for Hans, he sees the digital realm as affording coordination of actions. I mean, this resonates with the lecture from the Erlen Kimport book. These ideas, I mean, I guess this is not perhaps something new, and he also bases this on this idea that there is a kind of collective intelligence when many people come together, the power of cumulative connections. And you perhaps do recognize this argument from the French philosopher Pierre Lévy, who wrote a book in 1999 on collective intelligence, basically making this argument that machines help us to be more intelligent together. So this is also how he kind of approached the digital realm. Activism, for him, he has a very specific understanding of activism. I think this is important to underline here in the beginning. He understands activism as dissent, resistance, and rebellion. So it's a very conflictual understanding of activism. In a sense, it's kind of Muffian, radical pluralist, in that sense that he highlights conflict as important and as the defining character of activism. It includes civil disobedience here. And also he argues that it must be directed towards some kind of authority here. And I cannot help then to make a reference to my own definition of citizenship that we discussed in the previous lecture, and the importance of authority here. So activism has to be directed to an authority, and here Hans clearly outlines capitalism as the main form of oppression authority in society today. So he is in a way part of this Marxist, well, in a way part of a Marxist tradition here, and you may or may not agree with him about this, but this is, if we're gonna understand his account, this is how he understands the major authority or power, and what needs to be combated, what needs to be addressed in society is capitalism, according to him. And I think it's made very clear in this quote he made by Dyer Witherford on page 8 here. Neither patriarchy nor racism has succeeded in knitting the planet together into an integrated, coordinated system of interdependency, whereas capitalism has, and in doing so is subsuming every other form of oppression to its logic. So it's clearly visible here from the beginning what is the aim for Hans, what he's aiming at, what he wants to change, and that is capitalism. So activism for him, or rebellion, sometimes he uses this word as well, is about awakening the consciousness of the people. And this consciousness should then be directed towards combating the rule of the capital. So it's a very revolutionist idea here that resonates in early Marxist account, of course. You may or may not agree. As I said, I'm not promoting a revolution here. I'm just saying that this is how he sees it, and I think it's important to understand his opinion if we're going to criticize it later. Now, for him, he connects, and I think this is also very important because he connects technology to capitalism in interesting way. He argues that technology is central to sustaining the domination of capital in today's societies. So technology is going the errands of capitalism in that sense. So his argument here is that in order to combat capitalism, we have to take control over technology. And to do so, at heart of this lies consciousness, thinking, and thinking is dialogue and reflection. Now here we can clearly see that he's also inspired by Habermas, who in turn were inspired by Hannah Arendt. Let's be clear about this. She has been perhaps not as acknowledged for some of the thoughts that later Habermas was mentioning, but the focus of thinking, and now, I mean, he weds his conflictual revolutionary approach to Habermas in very interesting way. I'm not sure at all I agree, but this is of course something we can discuss in class. So as you can see, this is a highly theoretical account. Why I think it's also so interesting, because it's very theoretical and it's an interesting way how to theorize in this field. But he does return to many different theoreticians, many big shots, so to say, in order to prove his point. Marx, notably, but also Hannah Arendt, Jürgen Habermas, Heidegger, and Marcuse, not the least. And these are, interestingly, some academic gossip here. They are people who are all related to each other, more or less. Marcuse was Heidegger's PhD student, and then later we're going to talk about Andrew Feenberg, who was then Marcuse's PhD student. So they have a direct lineage there. And then of course, of course, I don't know, but many people know about the love affair between Hannah Arendt and Heidegger, who did have an abrupt end with the coming of the Nazi regime, where Hannah Arendt had to flee, take her refuge to the United States because of her Jewish origins. And as you might know, Heidegger was sympathizing with the Nazis. So, but it didn't prevent him from making out with a Jewish girl much younger than him. Anyway, enough said there. Let's continue with the lecture. So interestingly, Hans is very inspired by Habermas and his division between the system and the life world, as we talked about in the previous lecture. That communication belongs to the life world but has become overwhelmed by the market. So this is something he takes very seriously in his argument, Hans, here. And he tries, and I'm not sure he succeeds. I'm very happy to discuss this with you. But he tries to wed these conflictual starting points, his conflictual approach to Habermas. And he makes a point here on page 17 that consensus does not have to mean the elimination of difference, and that Habermas' theory of communicative action and communicative rationality can underpin radical intersubjectivity. And this I put here, see also meta-consensus, because this is some of the deliberative Democrats who have tried to meet the criticism from radical pluralists and Chantal Mouffe and others have kind of developed this idea of meta-consensus, that you don't have to agree upon everything, but you can agree that you should disagree or that you should respect each other. I mean, a concept that comes very close to Chantal Mouffe's agonism. Can you pull this off? Can you not? Let's discuss it. I'm not sure I agree with him, but this is how he phrases it here. And here, in line with this, he argues that rebellion here, or revolution, if you so wish, always entails a mutual recognition of others and solidarity and openness. Well, yes, I agree in that sense, but it's solidarity with not necessarily with others, it's with the in-group, with the us group. But he says that there is always some kind of intersubjectivity and in recognition and rebellion that can be linked to Habermas's approach of communicative action. I'm not sure I agree. What do you think? Let's discuss it. But he conceives of the individual as relying on intersubjective bonds, that we are connected to each other. I think this is perhaps the point he wants to make here. And you can compare this to other concepts, networked individualism, that those of you who took my course last semester, we talked about this concept. And it's out of this kind of intersubjective relation we have to each other that he argues from this standpoint that communicative rationality can contribute to solidarity in action. And this is where the digital comes in. As many others, this is where he thinks the technology and the digital realm can contribute to people connecting to each other and recognizing each other, something that he, as you will see, will argue is very important for rebellion. So technology. Now, basing his arguments in Heidegger here, he discusses technology and use of technology as either essentialistic or constructivist. Now, essentialistic, then, referring to Heidegger, basically means is there an essence, a core to technology that will not change over time, that will stay the same. And here his argument seems to be revolve around technology being something that's always happening, ongoing. It's a verb in that sense, a way of being and thinking. It's about bringing forth something. And this is also, if we go back to the Greek meaning of the word techne, as something that brings forth something else. And what this brings forth, and this way of being, he argues, is very exploitative. Basing his argument on Heidegger, is very violent and also very anthropocentric. Anthropos being the Greek word of man, is very man-centered, doesn't care about nature and other things. So it's a way for the use of humans, and this can also be labeled a modernistic view. Now, but it's not only, he argues, humans that uses technology. It's also technology that uses us. I mean, we have in other classes talked about this, technology having certain logics or affordances, for example. I mean, if you go on Twitter and it says what's up, what are you doing, then you are kind of being pushed to reveal constantly what you're doing. You're checking in on these geo-taggings in restaurants, in schools, etc. So you can also be pushed by technology to do things. Now, Hans, he does lean towards a more more social constructivist view of technology as something that is a product of specific context and historical movement. And here he returns back to Marx, to the original Marxist account, because the dominant context, the dominant force in society that he wants to relate this all to is capitalist. So in this way, technology is working in the doing, as we said, the errands of capitalism here. So and here he uses Marx as a way to link his critique of capitalism with technology, but he's not deterministic as perhaps Marx, you could argue Marx was. He does say that it doesn't have to be this way. Another world is possible. Technology does not have to serve capitalism. It can be turned against it, or can it be turned against it? This is perhaps the question he asks. I mean, he will answer affirmative to this question, but here he answers this question. So the logic of technology is forged in capitalist societies, but the mechanization that this technology is doing brings with it something else. It allows us a lot of free time, and free time here is liberating. I mean, this resonates with Marx, and this resonates with critical scholars. This resonates also with Pierre Levy. You can see clear lines of references here. So it liberates free time, and this can be could be used for other things. For example, to challenge capitalism. But there is a risk here, because technology also keeps us busy to engage us in consumption and exploiting us. I mean, just see social media, any social media, how we are revealing our wishes and our whereabouts and our feelings and our thoughts in a way that are later capitalized by Facebook and this group to target advertisers to us. So there is this kind of alienation and exploitation for real. Whether we become alienated or not, of course, is a question. It's a matter of discussion, but at least we can agree that there is some kind of exploiting aspect to this. And this is also made possible by technology, and this leads then to a one-dimensional society, which is also the it's the great thesis of Marcuse here: one-dimensional man, one-dimensional society, what he became famous of. But this is also what Adorno wrote about and Horkheimer in the Dialectics of Enlightenment. So very clear lineage, clear critical theory here. But he says then that another world is possible, as I said, that the capitalist bias of technology and the instrumentality of technology can be challenged. Doesn't have to be an instrument in the service of capitalism. And he argues that he calls this with an aesthetic morality. Now, I must admit to you that I'm not completely sure what he puts into these terms, aesthetic and morality here. So I cannot really explain what he means by calling this aesthetic morality, but this is how he calls it. And this is where he turns to Feenberg to discuss how change can occur through the use of technology. And as I said, Feenberg was the PhD student of Marcuse, who was the PhD student of Heidegger. So you can say that Heidegger is the academic grandfather of Feenberg. So Andrew Feenberg is now working in Canada. So technology embodies social values, not an essence. So he's turning against his academic grandfather here, Heidegger. There is no essence here. It's social values, and we know from previous lectures that values are something that can change and that can influence, that changes over time. So we can change technology and adapt it. But this can only be done through democratizing of technology, as he argues on page 41. Perhaps a new public sphere. Oh, we can tap into the discussion we had last week, or 2 weeks ago. But this is where activism has a role to play. And also by putting technology into the hands of the people, technology, or techno-capitalism, as he calls it, is opening itself to democratization. So you can see dual argument here in hands. On the one hand, technology allows free time when and it also and it allows to be democratized. It allows us to do different things, even though the bias, the logic, the affordance of technology is in the service of capitalism and consumerism. It does have this possibility if we are conscious about it. And then continuing with Hans' book, if we go to chapter 2, he's arguing for some kind of action research, referring that the author becomes a producer. You have to take stance with your research. He goes via Walter Benjamin to discourses of producage and the democratization of production online. I mean, these are arguments that we have heard later in Axel Brun's producer's presumption. So this is perhaps not that interesting, even though it's worth reading, of course, and perhaps important here because it does in a way talk about this emancipatory potential in this new productive forces online with this prosumer producage, the increasing blurring between transmitter or receiver, citing Eisenberger here, but also producer and consumer if you so wish. And he also talks about the mobilizing power of digital technology. We talked about this in the lecture, talking about Erling Kimpor's book. Because of many-to-many communication in multi-channel environments. This is an old story, we know about that. You can read more about it in the chapter 2. In chapter 3, Hans points to power mechanisms online and warns against the presentation of technology as a neutral tool. He goes back and forth here. It's the potential of technology to challenge capitalism. I mean, this is his goal, and the dangers of technology. It goes back and forth here in the chapters, and he underlines here again that the ideal of the consumer is what it's afforded or pushed for by technology, and even to realms of politics and democracy. He even argues that interactivity is an act of consumer-driven behavior, and this is what interactivity is used for us to be consumers, not to be politically engaged subjects. So he talks about this, and then he also talks about networks, going to the network discussion, and brings power into the equation here, into the discussion by talking about protocol also, because he says that networks are not necessarily non-hierarchical. It depends on the protocol, in the sense that there can be very centralized network. I mean, if you see the map here, there are perhaps a network there where everyone is connected to one node in the center. Then it's a very centralized network, and then they can be more decentralized or even distributed, where every node is connected to every node. But this depends on the protocol, who is deciding the structure of the network. So this, he kind of warns against the techno-optimist account here, that networks per se are democratizing. And this is also, Van Dyck writes this in his book, if those of you who read it last year, so you recognize this argument. So let me see, where were we? So yes, so and he says that this control that the protocol does in this, because most networks, according to him, are not decentralized or distributed. They are controlled in one way or another by the protocol. And he says that the protocol is to control society. He argues that we are in a controlled society, and the protocol is to control society what panopticon was to the disciplinary society. And this is also where Hans, with the help of Latour, questions the all-encompassing agency of humans. We delegate our decision to the machine, in the sense, through protocols and also algorithms. I mean, now you bought this book on Amazon, you might like this book because other people who made the same purchases as you bought this book, and etc. Or Spotify, you listen a lot to this music, perhaps you would like this music instead. So there is this sense of the machine taking over, and I know Sylvain will talk about this in his seminar on the singularity. So this is where Hans argues for mutual recognition in distributed networks, and networks without hierarchical protocol here, or protocol that makes it hierarchical. So mutual recognition in distributed networks. So they and because they are distributed, the nodes in the network go back and forth, and they have to listen to each other and send information back and forth. He then returns to Habermas and calls this kind of maximized communicative action. We can discuss it in class. And then in chapter 4, he turns against Habermas and criticizes him for being too pessimistic. Technology and media doesn't have to be assumed to an instrumental logic, as it's a social thing with social values of designers and users. So he goes back and forth between optimist and pessimist view of technology, and here he criticizes Habermas for being too pessimistic. Network doesn't have to stop at the borders. Network doesn't stop at the borders of the life world and system, but transverses them. So they have this potential to actually change things. And here he also criticized, perhaps interestingly, identity-based critiques of Habermas. I mean, aka the feminists' critique of him, having underlying counter-publics and publics on the basis that identity are constructed by capitalism in the first place. So he argues that identity politics and identity-based critiques are not valid. Anyway, he ends up where were we? So he ends up with an argument of networks as a locus for activism and technology. And what he argues for here, a very complex term, quasi-autonomous recognition networks, QARNs. Yes, it's a very complicated term, and I'm not sure I understand fully why he chooses to put these certain words together to label it. But this is what he says is in these kind of networks that activism can take place and change can happen. So these QARNs, for him, captures the practices of micro coordination, the communication back and forth, communicative action, and the context of cooperation and dynamics, and in a way that could be labeled also networked activism, or activists collaborating in networks. And here he underlines particularly recognition as being of prime importance in this QARN, because they have no borders, they're porous, therefore like he called them quasi-autonomous. I don't really see the connection between this and this, but this is how he argues anyway. uh, so these networks are organized around shared discourses or claims. I mean, Ernesto Laclau would call them demands, saving the bathhouse or wherever it can be. And then recognizing that these discourses or claims can be overlapping or shared, and you have identities in common, you know, even though he was against identities, but yeah, there are perhaps identities that are not forged in capitalist societies. So this is very important, this recognition of each other. Of course, if communicative action is going to happen, we have to recognize each other. Yes. So then in chapter 5 he makes this famous argument here about mobilization, and he talks about this as a process of going from demonstration to direct action. He wants a revolution. I mean, he has this Marxist endpoint to all this. So this to mobilize in direct action, it's importance of speed, organization and coordination, and the numbers. He calls these mobilizations because of the help of technology here. He talks about this as an intellectually acting swarm. I mean, how Reingold called this the smart mobs. He doesn't, I mean, we'll get to that why he doesn't want to call it the smart mob. So people are able to cooperate in ways never before possible because they carry devices with both communicating and computing capabilities, and they can mobilize and organize without being centralized, without having this centralizing power here, or the hierarchical power. So this is what he sees as the revolutionary potential of the technology here. Because of high connectivity between subunits, non-linear causality, they're not hierarchical, these networks, and they are intelligent, as he says, without a central control. And then, of course, what about the free rider problem? I don't know, we talked about this, but the free rider problem, that what if people just riding the action without contributing, or the activism without contributing, and then they will benefit in the end. I mean, why should I participate in a demonstration for higher salaries for associate professors if I in the end will benefit of the outcomes anyway, if the demonstrators are able to make changes to salaries? I don't have to bother with the demonstration. I just ride freely on the wave of their activism. Now, he says here, what about this problem, the free rider problem? Well, he says here the recognition, and that is so important online, or reputation, filters out this kind of free riders. People will contribute in order to enhance their reputation. And this I also find very interesting, because it was very critical of identity, and that identity being forged by capitalist logics per se. But this argumentation here, for me, comes very close to arguing for some kind of activist identity. I mean, I wrote about expressive rationality, that we act out of our will for we see ourselves as some kind of type of activism, that's for why we act. So I think there is an inconsistency here, but let's discuss it in class. So we do self-monitor, and we do care about our reputation, so we will collaborate. Basically, this is what he says. And then, yes, he doesn't call it smart mobs, he calls them swarms instead, because he doesn't think that smart mobs does not necessarily have to be smart at all, but they are all acting in relation to the disciplinary momentum of the gaze of the others. Basically, that we are adapting our behavior to the gaze of the others. This is a very Foucauldian argument in that sense. So that's not being smart, that's just being following the flow, and so therefore he turns to Jean-Paul Sartre and his concept of seriality to describe this, rather than talking about them as smart mobs. And then chapter 6 is basically exemplification of the Zapatista movement in Mexico, global justice movement, global social forums, etc. And then finally, it talks about this as constructing a common, or the common. Commons here is a general participatory realm of commonality, being based on many different authors who've written about this, Hart and Negri perhaps more so than others. So the commons here is not the same as commons. So could the internet, or should internet information communication be considered some kind of common, a commons here, a general participatory realm of commonality? And he discusses this out of Hart and Negri's concept of the multitude. So yes. Yeah, he argues here that individuals in the multitude have individual existence but work together. They valorize singularity without fetishization of the individual or individualism, alongside the collectivity of cooperation in the commons, sorry for the typo, and in the resistance of capital. Now this comes close to network capitalism, I think. And then of course there is this, his resistance to capitalism in general. So and what binds this multitude together is recognition, reputation, or I mean, I would say identity, but I don't know. So there you have it. And also, I mean, he bases this on Habermas, but perhaps Mouffe would be better for his argument. To make his argument, this we can also discuss. Now, this is it, guys. I know this book is not easy, but I hope this lecture has helped you in your reading, and that you find it as interesting with this theoretical elaboration and exciting as I do. And I hope that we can discuss this more closely in class. So, as usual, was there anything you didn't understand? And I'm sure there is. This is not an easy book, so please put it down, as well as things that you want to discuss. I mean, identity, the importance of identity, or perhaps have I misunderstood his use of Habermas? Do you agree with him? We can have these discussions. So I look forward to it, and yes, see you in class. Take care.